we'll turn our attention first to a study of business and industry in this age of social Darwinism. And the only place to begin is with a quick review of the impact of the railroads during this period. Without question, the railroad was the industry that drove the economy during this period. Pardon the pun. The nation, not long after the gold rush of the late 1840s, had turned its eye towards spreading across the West. And we've mentioned previously the impact of the railroad and the transcontinental railroad in spreading its impact across the West. But if you survey the map on your screen, it's impossible to avoid the realization that railroads spread their finger-like tendrils across the entirety of the country, including the East as well. The railroads also exemplify much that was true of big business and industry during this period. So over the next few slides, I'll review a number of the ways in which the railroads were typical of big business in the age of social Darwinism. One of the ways in which the railroads exemplified big business during this period is that they operated with the blessing and support of the federal government. It is sometimes said that this is the age of what we call laissez-faire government in terms of how it treated big business. Laissez-faire meaning hands-off, or government staying out of the affairs of big business. Now, this is true in the sense that the government made little effort to regulate or restrict the operations of big business. And we will talk shortly about things like labor conditions and the plight of the common worker. But the fact of the matter is that the government really didn't have a hands-off approach to business during this period. If anything, the government assisted big business. And this may be nowhere more clear than in how it treated the railroads of this era. The federal government perceived it as a national imperative that the country spread across the West and that settlers and business spread across the West. With that in mind, the government thought it appropriate to aid and assist the railroads in their quest to build lines across the West. We see this in the 1862 Pacific Railroad Act, which provided the railroad companies, already at the forefront of the national economy, provided them with additional money and tax breaks and loans in order to build their rail lines, and perhaps most importantly, granted the railroad companies land as they laid their track across the West. It granted them land on either side of that track. It's certainly worth noting that this land, which was given to the railroad companies, instantly became the most valuable land in the West. Of course, the land where the rail lines went through would be that land that attracted the most attention from homeowners and investors alike. And so not only was the federal government giving the railroad companies land, it was giving them the best and most valuable land. All told, the federal government granted the railroads more than 140,000 square miles of land. If you survey the map on your screen, you will note the highlighted areas, which was that land granted to the railroads, and especially in some of the northern parts of the country, there through North Dakota, Montana, and so on. Huge chunks of those states were given to the railroad companies. A second theme in which the railroads represent American business more broadly was the impact of technology. This was a period of tremendous technological and advance and inventions. Within the railroad industry itself, there were dramatic improvements in the technologies for making steel with the introduction of the Bessemer converter, improvements in the steam engine itself, and many other aspects of the building of the railroads and the track and bridges and so on themselves. A figure in the center of this trend was a man named Charles Crocker, who was the lead engineer in charge of building the Central Pacific Railroad. We discussed a little bit about Crocker in the previous lecture. It was Crocker who was given the task of constructing a railroad through the sort of terrain that you see in the picture on your screen. Incredibly mountainous and rocky and difficult, extreme changes in elevation. And yet somehow he had to build a railroad through this. His crew cut and blasted through rock, sometimes at the snail's pace of only a foot or so each day. At other times, building bridges and trestles like the one you see in your picture to cross rivers or gorges, building around and up the sides of mountains. It was an incredible engineering feat. As a related idea, the railroads are at the forefront of what becomes something of a national craze during this period for transportation and technology. Americans become consumed with these ideas. They were, for example, gripped by the round-the-world stunt of Nellie Bly, a 22-year-old female reporter who in 1889-1890 traveled around the world at the blistering pace of only 72 days. Telegraph lines, which reached the far corners of the world, brought news of her travels on a daily basis. Others were more concerned and nervous about these new developments. Dr. George Beard wrote famously in his work called American Nervousness in 1881, "We are under constant strain, mostly unconscious, oftentimes in sleeping as well as in waking hours, to get somewhere or do something at some definite moment." I think we can all sympathize with this feeling. He seems to be describing a very current trend in our country we might simply call stress. I think we all share some of those emotions. It's also worth noting that in George's writing, his chief villains, the reasons why we suffer from such things, are, in his words, quote, steam power, the periodical press, the telegraph, the sciences, and the mental activity of women. Sort of a curious final culprit, but a telling list nonetheless. A new term joined the American lexicon, commuter, as more and more Americans found their schedules fixed by the railroads and other forms of transportation. In fact, we all find our clocks and watches impacted by the railroad companies. It was the railroads on November 18th, 1883, that first implemented our current system of 4 time zones in order to ensure the smooth operation of railroads traveling across the country. A third way in which railroads typify the operation of big business during this era was the prominence of immigrants in doing much of the labor required to build the railroads. The Union Pacific and other railroads built in the East were built largely by a combination of Civil War veterans and also Irish immigrants who featured prominently in such work. But in the West, the Central Pacific Railroad was built almost exclusively by Chinese immigrants, as you see in the picture here. We have an incredibly telling statistic in terms of the immigration numbers from that period. In 1853, the year before the Central Pacific began its construction, the American government recorded 12 Chinese immigrants into the country. And that's not a typo, that is 12 Chinese immigrants. The following year, when the Central Pacific began its work, it recorded more than 13,000 Chinese immigrants, almost all of them brought into the country to work on that railroad. The final way in which the railroads were typical of big business during this time is in the prominence of incredibly harsh and cutthroat business tactics during this time. This is very typical of the social Darwinist mindset. The strong companies and businesses will survive, the weak will be devoured as part of this process. It is, in a sense, nature at work. And we see in the railroad business, especially in the early years, an incredibly fierce competition. Businesses rising and falling and winning out and being consumed at an astonishing rate. The railroad businesses would do anything to win out over their competitors. There are many examples of colorful and yet also ruthless businessmen during this period in the railroad industry. But one who stands out as particularly ruthless was Collis P. Huntington, who was the director of the Southern Pacific Railroad. Huntington would do anything to drive his competitors out of business. He was notorious during this period. Among his methods were legal means, such as establishing prices that were as low as the competition would bear. But he also did many other things, such as planting spies within the businesses of his competitors so that he would know what they were doing. He bribed legislators, newspaper writers, and judges, anyone that he thought might give him some sort of an advantage in business. Huntington was described as, quote, a hard old man with no more soul than a shark. That phrase reminds me very much of scenes from The Grinch, the scenes where the Grinch's heart is 2 sizes too small. But Huntington is only one example of many such ruthless competitors in the realm of the railroad business during this time. In fact, railroad companies found themselves exhausted by the process of underpricing and undercutting each other and going out of business at a rapid rate. And so by the 1870s, we see the railroad companies beginning to think that a sort of combination might be helpful rather than simply driving each other out of business. Perhaps we could work together to help lend some stability to this process. Initially, this was done on an informal sort of handshake basis in the form of what we call pools or cartels. This is more or less a gentleman's agreement. Leaders of various businesses would meet, establish prices or other kind of features that they wanted to employ, shake hands, and leave the room trusting that each other would follow along. As you might expect, the problem with such an arrangement is that it only took one person to go back on the agreement to ruin the whole affair. And so you could be certain that someone like Collis P. Huntington or Andrew Carnegie, who we'll talk about in a moment, would turn their back on those agreements very quickly. And so the companies established a more formal way of combining their companies, this in the form of what we call trusts. Under a trust, leaders of the companies would exchange stock in their companies. And this, takes away the incentive to drive your rival out of business if you own stock in the company. Trusts were a much more effective way to bring the companies together, forming monopolies or oligopolies. And in fact, with the proof of their effectiveness comes in the form of legislation from the federal government. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was determined to prevent this sort of combining in big business and in fact does break up some of the great monopolies. And so companies are forced to come up with yet another way of combining, which are holding companies. And there are many holding companies in our country even today. This is simply a form of coming together in which one sort of giant company purchases and owns other companies within it. Oftentimes, these smaller companies continue to operate under the name that you've always known them to be. I can think of several examples in the modern world. One that comes to mind is Facebook, which you may or may not be familiar is a monstrosity of a business, hundreds of billions of dollars. Facebook owns, for instance, Instagram. You might think you're using a different company when you're using Instagram, but it's owned by Facebook. Perhaps an even better example is the Disney empire. When we consider all the different companies that are owned and directed by Disney, such companies as Marvel Comics, the television network ABC, and that network itself controls ESPN, Pixar movies, the various Disney theme parks, and the cruise ship empire. All of these are different elements of one giant holding company, which is Disney.